Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast, where we bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders and influencers who are making headway and some waves in their industries. Today, we are joined by Dean Reuter, author of the groundbreaking book, The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. Dean is the General Counsel of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy and a Fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. His latest work uncovers the shocking story of General Hans Kammler, one of the most notorious, yet least known, Nazi war criminals. Dean, welcome to 5 a.m. Podcast, and thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Michael. It's great to be with you.
Good, thank you. I feel the same. I'm looking forward to chatting about this book. And first off, I have to ask you, how did America make a deal with the devil with this fellow?
That's a great question. That's sort of the end of the book, but we can cover that first. At the end of World War II, it was very clear to everyone, some months in advance, maybe as many as 18 months in advance of the end of the war, that Germany was going to lose the war.
Yeah.
It was also widely known by the Western Allies and Russia that Germany had all sorts of technology and expertise and records and research information that everyone wanted. And there was going to be this great scramble at the end of the war for anything of value, sort of by way of war reparations, booty almost. There was a lot of competition between the United States and Russia. What's interesting, though, is there was competition between the United States and France and Great Britain. It wasn't just the West versus the Eastern Allies. So one component of that research, it included, timing switches and radar and all sorts of weapons technology, but also nylon and synthetic rubber and synthetic oils and fracking technology. The Nazis and the Germans were ahead of us in a lot of ways, but principally the thing we wanted was the rocket research. The V1 and the V2 rockets that were the German wonder weapons.
Yes.
That were, the V2 especially, and we can talk about it in greater detail, way ahead of its time in terms of the technology involved and the ability to project power for a couple hundred miles after you lost air superiority. So it was a critical weapon, and it was important on the battlefield in World War II, but it was much more important as a piece of technology that would survive the war and then be developed into the ICBM and the moon rocket shot.
Really?
So that's why we made a deal with the guy who had control of the rocket scientists, the research records, soup to nuts. He was the guy in charge of all of Germany's secret weapons, including those rockets.
Wow. That's fascinating. So then Werner von Braun would have been under General Kammler.
He was. Werner von Braun was 2 levels down from Kammler, believe it or not.
Okay.
His immediate military supervisor was Dornberger. And above Dornberger was Kammler, above Kammler, Himmler, and then Hitler. So you're getting pretty near the top there. And you're smart to bring up Werner von Braun. He was the key rocket scientist. What surprised me, many things surprised me about this book, but one of the things that surprised me was the size of the rocket research team and the complexity of that V2 rocket. Which required so many different disciplines, not just engineering, but so many different parts working together to build a liquid fuel rocket. The German name on the drawing board for the V2 was the aggregate, which sounds like aggregate, which is exactly right. It's the accumulation and coordination of all these various parts working in perfect harmony to create that rocket.
Wow. There's so many questions that I have to ask you, of course, but the first one this will be my second question, I guess, but what made you want to write this book?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not going to say I was tricked into writing this book, but if you see the book, you'll notice it has 3 people named on the cover, myself and Keith Chester and Dr. Colum Lowry. Those were two researchers. I knew Keith Chester from my college days. He approached me at the outset of my part of this book and said, hey, you're a lawyer, can you write us a collaboration agreement so we can share our research? The two of them didn't know one another, but they were both researching this General Hans Kammler. And they wanted to be able to share their research without sort of stabbing one another in the back. So I wrote a collaboration agreement, and I thought I was done with it. And then Keith starts telling me about this Nazi general that had access to all of this high-value information, but was also in the center part of the war until the end of the war, basically in charge of the Holocaust. He is the guy, as Hans Kammler, also in charge of secret weapons, is the guy who identified Auschwitz as the killing camp, who put the gas chambers and the ovens into Auschwitz and made the Holocaust possible, and then duplicated that work from one killing camp to another, to another, to another, and then basically helped run Germany's slave labor trade. So he started explaining some of these things to me. I was like, there's no way that there's a story about somebody who was so powerful, so evil, that then did a deal with the United States, a secret deal at that, a deal that nobody's ever heard about before. No way that's possible. So, Keith then started sending me bits and pieces, some documents here or there, and got me interested enough that I agreed to be the principal author and then joined in the research, made trips to Europe. I mean, the research is, I can go on for hours about the research itself, which was done everywhere in U.S. National Archives all over Europe, but small libraries, little collections, interviews everywhere, Freedom of Information Act requests, the research that the three of us undertook, but mostly Dr. Lowry and Keith Chester, just, mind-boggling to me, the amount of research that went into this. So I got in as a lawyer at the outset, but then, I love puzzles. I love to solve things. And there was that's what this felt like. It felt sort of like you're living in a thriller, a Hollywood thriller, something like that.
Fascinating. So I'll just start with a personal anecdote from my grandfather, who lived in Friesland, which is a northern province of Holland, or the Netherlands, I should say, just on the German border. And they had friends and business relationships. And during the war, there was a concentration camp fairly close to the border. Mm-hmm. And that was like a bakery. And so they baked bread there for the army, and different, of course, than Auschwitz. I understand that. Is there even a rationale that could be quantified as to how the Germans made a decision on who was the slave labor and then who was sent to the gas chambers for execution?
Yeah, that's another good question. And it turns out that that there was a division in the highest ranks of the Nazi regime. There were those who wanted to, the priority was to exterminate the Jewish race. That was the ultimate goal. There were also those who wanted to win the war, and thought, every dollar, every man hour we spend collecting Jews, transporting them, and then exterminating them, is resources we could have devoted to winning the war. So there was this great tension at the top of the Nazi ranks, and the way it was resolved was we are going to collect everybody, transport them, kill the infirm, the elderly, the very young, the people who are not able to work, enslave the rest, but use them in a way that really is designed to grind them into dust, to kill them in the process of extracting every ounce of labor they could from them. So that's the way that tension was resolved. And Kammler was one of the keys in, this is a horrible vision of envisioning that we can have a killing camp, we can have slave labor camps. The slave labor camps are going to be adjacent to where we need them. They were adjacent to the munitions and the rubber factories, but also the bakeries, the things that fed the German people. But it was exploitation beginning to end.
Now, do you think that this slavery was one of the key factors in why Germany did so well?
It certainly contributed to their, I mean, they were in a total war economy.
Yeah.
And, so many of their, young and then even middle-aged and older male population were off fighting battles as soldiers. You end up with a depleted population in terms of a workforce, and this was their way to augment that workforce. And I do think there were huge benefits to the German population, the German government, the SS, who had its own set of slaves. Contributed mightily to sustaining Germany and building weapons too. I mean, most of the weapons, including the V-2 rockets, they were built by slaves. There's a lot of evidence, and some of it we put in the book about slaves resisting, slaves sabotaging weapons, slaves.
Is that right?
But that was a very precarious thing, to try to steal a potato or a piece of bread to feed yourself. That was verboten. To try and sabotage a V-2 rocket, very, very risky.
Right. And I do want to just circle back now to General Kammler. With the description over him of him being the worst Nazi war criminal we've ever heard of.
Yeah.
Can you describe why he is, how he earned this title?
Yeah, I mean, it's a title that we impose on him, I think. But I think it's very accurate, and it's because nobody was as close to so much of the evil, Michael. I can't really begin to describe completely how essential he was to the perpetration of the Holocaust and the slave labor. Nobody sort of straddled that fence the way he did. He was literally on site at Auschwitz. He didn't do this from Berlin. He was a hands-on guy. He was on site at these killing camps, making sure everything was just so. And he's the guy who, for example, Auschwitz at the time was really 2 camps. And the original design, the train tracks are coming in there. We're going to make this the slave labor camp, and the killing camp is over here. And he just had the simple idea of reversing those, because he knew we're going to want to kill the old people and the infirm and the children. They're not going to be able to walk this 2 miles. So let's do that in order to ramp up efficiency. And that's what he did. And he's the one who decided, well, we'll have the gas chamber and the ovens one on top of another with a freight elevator to reduce the amount of human effort needed to, pile those bodies from the into the oven. I mean, it's that sort of horrible thinking that in my mind makes him one of the worst. It's also statements of his fellow SS officers. He's the worst human being ever.
Is that right?
We also found the wanted lists that were put out country to country to country to country. So many countries wanted Hans Kammler for so many different war crimes. It's mind-boggling. Unfortunately, though, conventional history reports that at the end of the war, he died. And we were in touch with the Mossad, we were in touch with the U.S. Nazi hunters, with the Wiesenthal Center. Nobody looked for Kammler because he was reported dead. But as we reveal in the book, he didn't die at the end of the war.
Well, I was going to ask you if he made his way over to Argentina or somewhere. We can get to that in a second, but I wanted to ask, in your research, did you come across any personal anecdotes or evidence as to where his source of evil came from? Like, was this fellow just cut from a different cloth?
Yeah, so you're asking really good questions, Mike. I try to, my heritage is German. I was born here in I was born in Heidelberg, Germany, because my U.S. Army officer father was stationed in Germany. And my people have been in the United States since the 1800s. But I tried to wrap my mind around what it takes for one of the most highly evolved civilizations, Germany, in the 1930s, to run so completely off the rails. And I try to provide some answers to that in the book. With regard to Kammler himself, he grew up during World War I. He came of age during World War I. And he is one of the German citizens who felt like that's a war we were going to win. We were being led to greatness, the reunification of the German Empire. This is going to be fantastic. And all of a sudden they surrender. And it was out of the blue. And then you have the Treaty of Versailles, which is the resolution of World War I and a regime of penalties imposed on the German people by way of war reparations. The German population felt they were horribly mistreated under the Treaty of Versailles, resented it tremendously, and suffered. They did suffer. I mean, their economy was horrible. There were wheelbarrows full of cash being taken around because, the inflation was so rampant. So that laid the groundwork for the entire, population to be resentful. But that also affected Hans Kammler directly. There are no excuses in any of this. This is not say, okay, well, now I understand why the Holocaust happened. But by 1933, this is 12 years before the war, as a young man, he wrote a treatise that envisioned, pretty much tracked with Mein Kampf, Hitler's tome, but Kammler's treatise envisioned the German government taking over all the Eastern lands and wiping out the local populations through slavery, through the use of slavery, and repopulating those areas with ethnic Germans. So he was an ideologue. He was not just a follower. He was not one of the, you hear about people who are cogs in the machine, just following orders. That wasn't him. That wasn't him. He was an ideologue. He was a true believer. He became a Nazi before Hitler became chancellor. He joined the SS before Hitler became president of Germany. So he was on at the ground floor. When you asked for an anecdote, there is this, to me, a fascinating anecdote. It doesn't explain his evil, but he had 5 children, and one of his daughters, as an infant, and this is before the Holocaust, as an infant, she's in the hospital in the care of, in a ward, in the care of nurses. One of the nurses leaves a bottle of ether open near the baby girl, who dies. She's literally gassed, Hans Kammler's daughter.
Wow.
And he goes on to invent or to perfect the gassing of millions of people. And it's like that. I suppose that's an anecdote. It's horrid. And I found myself thinking, here's a guy who suffered through that. Maybe he'd have some human compassion, but it's almost as if he took a lesson from that.
Yeah.
And to, in the most perverted way possible.
Yeah, that's awful. So how did this fellow, I don't even want to use his name and title and all of that, but how did this individual rise to a position of such power that surpassed even Heinrich Himmler by the end of the war?
Yeah, it was sharp elbows and efficiency. So in the first parts of the year, he was trained as an architect and an engineer. And in the first years of the war, he did some pretty benign things. He was just making buildings, making roadways, test tracks, communication centers. But he became known, Michael, as the guy who was extraordinarily efficient at procuring scarce goods and organizing workforces and systematizing processes, almost like sort of the Henry Ford production line thing.
Really?
He became very adept at that. And so when it became time to start building concentration camps, it's like, he's the guy. Let's rely on him. And he, as we all know, unfortunately, he excelled at that. There were hundreds of concentration camps built. He designed the barracks. We have the architectural drawings with Hans Kammler scribbled on the bottom. And they were proposed as brick barracks. And he said, no, that's too expensive. We're going to make them out of wood. And where there was one number of occupants in the margin put in there. So this is designed to house this number of people.
Yep.
In his handwriting, he strikes through that number and it creates a larger number. So what's already an overcrowded, unlivable barracks, really, he just crams more people in that. So he was recognized for efficiency in a regime that was already efficient, recognized as a true hardliner, and just kept going up the ranks. And ended up in charge of all of Germany's secret weapons. He was, importantly, an Obergruppenführer. You asked about titles, or you mentioned titles. There was one person in the final year of the war, one person who was elevated to that master level of Obergruppenführer, and it was Hans Kammler. The only person who got that promotion in the final year of the war. That's how important he was to the Nazis.
Wow. That's yeah, it's jaw-dropping information, and it causes me to think back that my Bep and Paka, so that's what we called them in our language. They were the grandfather. They lived in Friesland during World War II and made their way to Canada. They had these two books that my mom said that they never showed their children, but my Paka would share this with me and my older brother, and they were these Dutch books, photo books called Nazi Hell. And I would certainly look through those books with a different light now, having this conversation about General Kammler. I want to ask you, what were some of the challenging aspects of uncovering Kammler's story?
Well, principally, the organization or lack of organization of the records of World War II. I've really come to think of World War II as the single largest undertaking of human effort in the history of the world, in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
It involved 100 million people or so, 60 million people died, but it involved tens of millions of people at all levels doing all sorts of things all around the world. And at the end of the war, as hostilities ended, it's as if everybody just put all the papers they had in their hands in a box, folded them up, and sent them to Washington. And most of those records are not digitized. They're not photographed. Some of them are on reels, microfiche reels. And there's really no rhyme or reason to a lot of those records. So they're very difficult to search. It's also the case, and one of the archivists said as much, that the Kammler deal, Kammler's suicide, his suicide was reported and adjudicated by a German court. But we, the Americans, we knew that wasn't true. We covered it up, and I think we did a good job of covering the records too. The number of records for somebody at that level of government, you can go through and find Himmler records endlessly. But to find a Kammler record, very difficult.
Wow. It's almost difficult. Like he was prized. So, seeing as though we're talking about the U.S. and paperwork, Operation Paperclip comes to mind.
Yeah.
And so I got to ask, how does Kammler's story relate to Operation Paperclip?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, Operation Paperclip, for those of your listeners who don't know, that was a program under which, this harkens back to my talk about all the technology and all the manpower and the people that Germany had and the scramble for those people. Operation Paperclip was a way to take the most important of those and bring them to the United States. And in the process, that involved, the Department of Defense, the different branches of the military. It also involved the State Department. It also involved our intelligence services. And there was a sifting of people and some attempt to determine who were the most valuable and to bring them to the United States. But in the process, their records were often sanitized. So you would have people that were involved in slave labor trade, and that was erased from their record or minimized in their record in order to make them palatable enough to bring to the United States.
Wow.
And one of the more troubling things I found in doing the research for this book is that it was the people who were highest up, the Nazis who were highest up, who had the best information, the most resources that offered the greatest value. And so those were the ones who were consequently rewarded, came to the United States. Later, many of them became U.S. citizens, lived out their lives in the United States. And in the case of von Braun, he really became an American hero.
Yeah.
And we have a whole chapter in the book about von Braun and the things we found out about him that have never been reported that indicate that he was much more involved and much more aware of the Holocaust and more involved in the slave labor trade than anybody's ever been, made to believe or had understood. And he's buried here in Northern Virginia as a hero. And, if you've researched him, you see pictures of him with Walt Disney and making the rounds on behalf of NASA. And he did get us to the, I don't think we get to the moon first without Wernher von Braun on our team. There's an old Bob Hope joke that we got to the moon before the Russians did because our Nazi scientists were better than their Nazi scientists. And,
he was on point with that one.
So that was Operation Paperclip. And that was all done, by the way, sub rosa. It was done secretly. A lot of people could see that there are Germans now living in the United States, but it was done undercover and not really revealed and not really understood until decades later.
It really sounds like the intellectual property was the spoils of war.
It was, and you're right to say that, but it wasn't just, the 2-pager that has a patent on it. It was the brains behind that. We wanted those people as well.
Yeah.
So we took the hardware, and we had 100 V2 rockets that we shipped back over here.
Really?
We took all the plans and all the records we could find, and we took the people who were in charge of, who had the intellectual property in their heads, basically, and who could continue to develop. These were not, the V2 was a great weapon, revolutionary at its time, but it needed a lot of advancements to get to the moon.
Right. So I want to, just as we're wrapping up, I am going to ask you about how people can get your book, but I have to, there was a book I read in 7th grade about the Nazis developing their supersonic jets. And that caused me to draw the conclusion, even at that young age, that Germany started preparing for World War II at the end of World War I. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely true, even under the Treaty of Versailles. Mm-hmm. And I think most nations are going to, almost any nation is going to try and have an ability to defend itself. But Germany very quickly started producing offensive weapons. And there's a real difference. One of the interesting aspects of the rockets is under the Treaty of Versailles, a lot of weapons development was forbidden. Rockets weren't mentioned because they weren't really understood as weapons at the end of World War I at the Treaty of Versailles. So developing the rockets was technically permissible. And von Braun and Dornberger were working on rockets back in 1933, so 12 years before the war began.
Wow. And so did Germany engage any of their neighboring nations in their military research and development during that time?
They did. I mean, they were working with Russia principally on a lot of these things, and the alliance and then the lack of an alliance between Germany and Russia is famous. And they, obviously they end up as enemies, mortal enemies. But no, at times they were in league with one another.
Yeah.
And of course, in the between years of the war, like Germany was a civilized nation, and they had exchanges of information and, conferences that the Germans would go to Sweden and the Brits would go to Germany. There was a lot of culture exchange as well.
Wow. Fascinating. I've got like a whole list of more questions to ask, so we'll have to save that for part 2 and 2 through 7. But Dean, how can people find this book?
Well, it's on Amazon. Amazon is probably the easiest way to do it. Skyhorse Publishers is you can go to their website and find it. But on Amazon, it's in hardback. It's been successful enough. It's come out in paperback already. Good. It's on Kindle if you want to read it on your device. There's also a nice Audible version of it, read not by me, but by somebody else.
And are you on any social media outlets in case people want to follow your work?
If people have questions, if they want to, we're hoping that more and more information comes out, but my email is pretty easy to remember. It's deanreuter@gmail.com. That's the best way to reach me if you have a question or if you want to reach out to me somehow.
Good. We'll put that up. A sincere pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was an excellent conversation. I love this one. So thank you very much. And thank you to our listeners and watchers. We appreciate you being here. And now is a great time to share this podcast with your network and your friends and family. I know you have people that their names are rolling around in your head and you're thinking, so-and-so's got to listen. And yes, they do. We appreciate your support. Please head over to 5ampodcast.com, drop a couple bucks in the Buy Me a Coffee cup, and also don't forget about our website, myinstantgold.com, where you can buy gold and silver for as little as $10 at a time. Thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate your support.